Today we're going to go over trust and ethics in nuclear power. Um, Before I get started, one of the things I need to go over real quick is a personal issue I have when it comes to people talking about nuclear power. I don't really like talking about nuclear power, and the reason for that is there's a lot of misinformation. There's so much misinformation that when in doubt, I just assume what someone's saying is wrong because the amount of objective information is finite, and it appears that the um, misinterpretations, exaggerations, the lack of understanding is infinite. Not only that, there are people who, when they talk about nuclear, talk about it in very objective, matter-of-the-fact manners that did their research, did their work, and they have opinions based on a tangible piece of information. And then there's a lot of people, an exponentially larger number of people, who have opinions based off of feelings. And not to say that that's not right or wrong, but when you're an engineer, you're expressly told not to do that. And so you end up having to have arguments that use a lot of I feel statements when you are talking about something very technical. And so feelings run high, and when an ugly fact gets in the way of a beautiful theory, people don't tend to accept it kindly. Uh, While we talk about nuclear power, we need to explain in terms of how does it work. So there's two main types of nuclear power. There's fusion reactions. These are the big explosions that you see. In this case, we have deuterium colliding with tritium. These are types of hydrogen atoms. For a very brief period of time, they make this form of lithium. It is unstable, and it breaks apart very quickly, and it makes helium and a gamma ray, or a neutron. It also releases an enormous amount of energy. The actual use of fusion reactions tends to be in bombs. Yes, if you read the news, there have been some recent breakthroughs on the way they handle plasma magnetic fields, and they were able to maintain a fusion reaction. But I do not believe we're at the stage where we can build a power plant with them. However, we do see them in explosions. We also see this in the sun. This is a typical fusion bomb. So a fusion explosion begins with the detonation of the fissionary stage, the primary. Its temperature soars past approximately 100 million Kelvin, causing it to glow intensely with thermal rays, specifically X-rays. These X-rays flood the void, that vacuum, the radiation channel, often filled with polystyrene, between the primary and the secondary assemblies placed within the enclosure called the radiation case, which confines the X-ray energy and resists its outward pressure. The distance separating the two assemblies ensures that debris fragments from the fissionary primary, much more slowly than the X-ray photons, cannot disassemble the secondary before the fusion explosion runs to completion. The secondary fusion stage, consisting of the outer pusher dampener, fusion fuel filler, and central plutonium spark plug, is imploded by the X-ray energy impinging on the pusher dampener. This compresses the entire secondary stage and drives up the density of plutonium spark plug. The density of plutonium fuel rises to such an extent that the spark plug is driven into a supercritical state and begins a nuclear fission chain reaction. The fission product of this chain reaction heat the highly compressed and thus super dense thermonuclear fuel surrounding the spark plug to around 300 million Kelvin, igniting the fusion reaction between the fusion fuel nuclei. In modern weapons, fueled by lithium deuterium, so it's a type of lithium that's particularly heavy, the fissioning plutonium spark plug also emits free neutrons that collide with lithium nuclei and supply the tritium component of the thermonuclear fuel. The secondary is relatively massive tamper, which resists the outward expansion as the explosion proceeds, also serves as the thermal barrier to keep the fusion fuel filler from becoming too hot, which could spoil the compression. If made of uranium, enriched uranium or plutonium, the tamper captures fast fusion neutrons and undergoes fission itself, increasing the overall explosion yield. Additionally, in most designs, the radiation case is also constructed of fissile material that undergoes fission driven by fast thermonuclear neutrons. Such bombs are classified as two-stage weapons, and most current Taylor-Ulam designs, which is this, are such fission weapons. Fast fission of the tamper and radiation case is the main contribution to the total yield and is the dominant process that produces radioactive fission product fallout. All right, that was a mouthful. All right, the other option you have is nuclear fission. What is fission? So the way I remember it is a fusion reaction is when you fuse atoms together, and a fission reaction is when the atoms fissile out. So the neutron here collides with an atom that is unstable, so in this case Utonium-235. It makes an attempt to fit itself into the nucleus, doesn't quite fit, causes the atom to split and makes barium and krypton, but it also emits 3 neutrons. And if there's another uranium atom on the other side of that reaction, it happens again. That is why in nuclear reactors you need a minimum percentage to be U-235, and in bombs you need a very high percentage for it to be a runaway. However, the vast majority of the time that you see nuclear power in the fission process is in a power plant. Now there's a lot of nuclear power plant designs. I'm going to go over one of the more common ones, easier to understand. So in this diagram you see 2 sections, the nuclear part and the conventional part. The conventional part runs just like a regular power plant. You've got some heating source, that heating source boils water, that water is driven into a turbine, that turbine generates electricity, the steam then goes to some kind of condenser. That's really what's driving the steam to go from point A to point B, is that condenser, and then a pump pumps the water back into the boiler. The nuclear part is a bit more complicated. This is an ethics class. I'm not really going to go into the specifics of how that works, but in generally speaking, all it's doing is maintaining a minimum temperature of that yellow loop. And that yellow loop is always hot enough to boil the water. Now, in the US, a lot of what I'm about to say is specific to the US. There are 2 instances that you would see a nuclear power plant. The first one is a civilian application. In the United States, there are 93 nuclear power reactors. They are owned by 54 separate nuclear power plants in 28 states. These power plants represent what's equivalent to about 20% of all of the electricity consumed in the US. If I'm not mistaken, and feel free to check me on this, they are all referred to as base load. So years in advance, they announce to the electric grid how much electricity they're going to make every day. And the electric grid gives them a discounted rate, promising that, they know that they're going to make that amount of power, so they're going to give them a certain amount of money. and their agreements tend to be a lot longer with the grid. The other application is military applications. There are 72 nuclear subs. Each of those submarines has about one reactor. There are 10 carriers in the US fleet. They have about 2 reactors each. There's one research vessel that has 1 reactor. Because of this, when they talk about submarine range, they never use the fuel. The fuel lasts decades. Yes, sometimes they need to be refueled, but the real limiter in a submarine isn't the fuel. Well, it's the fuel, but it's the fuel for the people. It's the food stores. Once the submarine runs out of food, that's when it has to resurface. And that can be quite a long time. Now, there are some advances in nuclear power that are quite interesting. Again, this is an ethics class, so I can't go over all of them, but I am cherry picking the one that I like. These are the small modular reactors. When I got out of college, modular construction was the new buzzword. Nuclear tends to be a little bit behind just because they have to adopt things that have already been validated to work. So they tend to be about a decade behind in a lot of technology, but when they adopt something new, it tends to already, all of the bugs have been worked out. And they do this because it's a safety issue. These reactors are a bit smaller. You know what? A bit smaller is not the right word. A lot smaller than a regular reactor. Their footprint's smaller. Because they're smaller, they're a lot easier to ensure that they're safe. They can be built off-site. This is an interesting tidbit. You'll find this if you ever start working in the field. If you have a group of people, group of technicians, and they make the same product every day, and they do that for years, they are always going to be better at it than their competition. So you can be more reliant on quality from the modular designs because it's always made by the same group of people. If you have to hire a special set of welders, you tend to go with the welders that are in the area. And they might not be familiar with the nuclear requirements, and they will weld to the requirements that they know. However, if you are making these at a factory off-site, those welders always know what the requirement is because it doesn't really change for them. These units don't have to be refueled as often. If there's an issue, a lot of times it's because of refueling. You'll see one example of that as we go through this lesson. And they're just cheaper. Now, granted, I said in one of the classes, don't reference cost because that always makes people think the reason you're making the decision is because of cost, but I'm not trying to sell you a nuclear power plant today. So there are a lot of trust issues with nuclear power. And for good reason. The most common one has to do with weapons. Nuclear power plants often possess dual-use capabilities. They not only generate electricity, but they are also used to produce the fissile material like uranium and plutonium, which are essential for nuclear weapons. An alternative to plutonium and uranium exists in the form of thorium, which can be used in a nuclear reactor to produce electricity, but cannot be weaponized. Despite this, numerous countries, who I will not name in this class, continue to favor uranium and plutonium in their nuclear programs, raising questions about their intention and broader implications for global nuclear and non-proliferation efforts. So at this point, I want you to think about, why would the US favor nuclear weapons at all? The US owns one of the biggest stockpiles of them. Why do we have them? So I'm going to give you about 5 seconds to pause it and think about it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So one primary factor was the limited precision of conventional weapons when they were first invented. So during World War II, the only conflict where nuclear weapons were actually used in combat, targeting accuracy was very poor. It was so poor, in fact, that the US would often publicly announce the targets ahead of time. So anyone who did the German IEP probably heard the story about City Hall being bombed. What happened was the US announced to the people of Braunschweig, we are going to target your church. Now, normally this would sound awful, but because the accuracy was so low, they knew that if they targeted the church, they wouldn't actually hit the church. They'd blow up everything around the church. And sure enough, they did. However, the town hall was one of the buildings next door, and that building got hit directly by a bomb. Now, if you go to Europe, specifically Germany, you will find that a lot of the churches have a grid pattern built around them in the city. And as you get further and further away from the church, that grid pattern slowly turns into a ring pattern. A lot of the German IEP students probably lived on a street called Raben Ring. The reason for this is the center part of the city would get blown up because they were targeting the church, was at the center of the city, and when they rebuilt, it would become a grid. This happened in a lot of cities in Europe. Now, by the time the bomb was ready, Europe had surrendered, and the US changed its sights from Germany to Japan. The reason they targeted Hiroshima was partly because it housed a military headquarters, which was you couldn't hit it with conventional weapons of the era. Something similar applied to Nagasaki. They just weren't going to be able to hit all of the Mitsubishi factories in the same manner. So they chose to hit them with a nuclear bomb, or atomic bomb really, because fusion reactions hadn't been mastered at this time. Now, currently the US and the Western partners, specifically NATO partners, are increasingly moving away from reliance on nuclear weapons. As much as I would like to say it's for moral reasons, it's not. The primary strategic value of these weapons now lies in their role as a deterrent, both in preventing large-scale military engagements. That is to say, if a country were to build a large army, it'd be a perfect target for a nuclear bomb, and it also discourages other countries from using them. Now, in the US and our allies in NATO, we have decided to switch to what's called precision strikes. You might understand these as the high-value targeting the US did with ISIS, or the War on Terror, where the US could actually hit a specific building in the middle of a city and only blow up a certain section of that building because they knew that's where the target was. Because of this capability, we're shifting away from the use of nuclear weapons just because it's now outdated. This tactic is much more effective. However, not all of the global actors agree with this tactic, mostly because precision weapons are expensive and hard to build and hard to design. So if you look at some of the Ukrainian cities that are actively being targeted, you can see that the decision to target civilians is a key factor. All right. So, this is the next major reason people tend to not like nuclear power. Chernobyl. So this is the PNID for the Chernobyl reactor. It was referred to as an RBMK. I have bulleted, or not bulleted, but I've boxed off the actual order of events. So first they disconnected the core cooling system. Once that was disconnected, they started to remove the control rods. They activated a set of extra pumps. During this process, there was xenon buildup. A set of emergency alarms started to go off. The technicians thought these were nuisance alarms. Because they thought they were nuisance alarms, they ignored them, and I think they also deactivated them. Obviously, in hindsight, they weren't nuisance alarms. They were actually warning that something bad was happening. Once the alarms were deactivated, the core heated at an exponential rate, and a runaway reaction occurred. The core simply got hotter and hotter. This caused the steam pressure in the reactor to grow. It's known that the AZ-5, the scram button, was pressed before detonation, but it's unclear if this caused the explosion or if the explosion would have happened anyway. So I'm not going to go into great detail about exactly what happened. This is the general gist of what happened. But once the runaway reaction occurred, the bomb more or less the reactor became a bomb, a kinetic bomb, not a nuclear bomb. And the pressure had to go somewhere, so the pressure went up. So this is the GIF of the before and after of the Chernobyl reactor. Now, you can kind of see it, and I can send this GIF out if you want to watch it yourself. But you can see a disc that's clearly been flipped. That disc weighed several tons, and it just flipped upside down. So the immediate response to this is probably the real reason people don't trust nuclear power. It wasn't so much the fact that it had a meltdown. I mean, meltdowns are bad, but it was the way it got handled is what caused people to say, I don't trust it. So at 1:30 in the morning on April 26th, 1986, the reactor blew up. The local authorities contacted Moscow and said that there was nothing to worry about. It was a minor fire. Only after 36 hours, and people started to die from radiation who were nowhere near the power plant, did they acknowledge that they had to do something. They started an evacuation of Pripyat. They told the locals that they were going to come back in a few days because they honestly believed that was the case, because they were ignoring how terrible this event was. After 10 days, they realized how bad things really were and made a permanent exclusionary zone. The USSR denied that this happened at all until, I believe, a Swedish early warning system stated that a nuclear bomb had gone off nearby, which tells you how much radiation was released because this happened in the Ukraine. And then the USSR acknowledged that it happened. Now there's 3 Mile Island. People always talk about 3 Mile Island in comparison to Chernobyl. I think that's a very inappropriate comparison. So this is 3 Mile Island. You can see one set of steam stacks going, and you see another set not going. You'll understand why in a minute. So it was commissioned in September of '74. It was decommissioned in September of 2019. It was what's called a pressurized water reactor. It was built by Babcock and Wilcox. That company was founded in Providence, believe it or not. And it experienced a partial reactor meltdown in March of 1979, so 5 years after it was commissioned. So this is the schematic for their reactor. All right, so there was a water interrupt event between the steam generator and the turbine. Effectively, there was a sticky valve. The valve, it was opening and closing, but they didn't have full control over it. So they started trying to regain control of it so that way they could leave it at full open. An early warning system activated because that's not supposed to happen. Now, technically, they were doing a maneuver that they were allowed to do, but being that this was the 70s, the computer system wasn't working too sophisticatedly. So it started a system shutdown, which in and of itself, not really a problem. Then the scram and relief valve activated. That is to say, the control rods were shoved into the reactor to shut it off, and the relief valve opened. Unfortunately, that relief valve failed open. At which point, the reactor tried to come back to temperature because that valve was open. It couldn't. This caused all the water in the reactor vessel to boil off. So now there's nothing in the reactor vessel to cool it down. So the emergency coolant system activates. So you can see the pumps right there. The day before this event, they had replaced those pumps. And to do that, they had to close the valves, remove the pumps, and then put in new pumps. The standard operating procedure was to open that valve back up once it was installed. Unfortunately, they didn't do that. So the pumps activated, but the valve was shut, so they weren't able to refill the reactor vessel. This caused the reactor vessel to overheat. So this is the presumed state of the reactor. Based off of the information we have, this is the best guess of what it looks like on the inside. So everything looks normal until you get about halfway down the image. The control rods, or not the control rods, but the uranium rods melted. Some nasty stuff. This is the series of events. As soon as the power plant realized there was a problem, so it took about an hour for steps 1 through 6 to occur, power plant contacted the Pennsylvania Environmental Protection Agency, also known as PEPA. PEPA immediately contacted the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Pennsylvania governor, and the Pennsylvania lieutenant governor. After 16 hours of the initial event, the core temperature fell enough for operators to assess the damage. After 24 hours of the initial event, the head chemist volunteered to measure the radiation inside the containment building. Ed experienced way in excess of what the legal limit was and left before he could finish because he knew that there was a problem. After 28 hours, that's when they announced an evacuation. So, I didn't really go into what happened at Fukushima because Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island are similar in the sense that it was caused by human error. Fukushima happened because of a series of unlikely events all occurring in a row. And it was awful, but not that bad. So in Chernobyl, there's at least 4,000 confirmed deaths due to radiation. This number is larger depending on how you count them. People who got cancer should be counted in here, but a certain percentage of the population gets cancer anyway, so it's hard to say whether someone would have or wouldn't have gotten cancer and died. There's an exclusionary zone around Chernobyl. There's a permanent increase in the radiation around Chernobyl. That exclusionary zone is 30 kilometers. 3 Mile Island, nobody died. Cancer rates in and around the area didn't change. There isn't an increase in radiation. People were able to move back in a few days later. Fukushima. Deaths is a misleading term here because some people did die, but not because of the radiation. They died because they panicked. They tried to evacuate in unsafe ways, and in doing that, they died. I'm not putting it here because it's not due to radiation. The area in and around Fukushima did experience an increase in radiation, 3 microsieverts. So how much is a millisievert? Well, the average dose from natural radiation per year for Americans is 6 millisieverts. There is no exclusion zone around Fukushima. I'm trying to be objective here. I'm going to have a hard time doing that because I am biased. But comparing Chernobyl to either 3 Mile Island or Fukushima is grossly inappropriate. In the case of 3 Mile Island, they notified everybody as fast as they could, and all the radiation was contained to one building. In Chernobyl, the radiation was spread across all of Europe, and they ignored it for days. Making a comparison between the two is intellectually dishonest. So I can't list every nuclear regulation in the US. I just can't. It would take more time than we have class for. What I can mention are the 3 main bodies that regulate it. The first is the International Atomic Energy Agency. They promote safety, secure, and peaceful nuclear technology use. They establish international safety standards. They provide expert guidance, and they do facility audits. Nuclear power is one of those things that just because the US is using it doesn't mean it's not affecting our neighbors. So it's reasonable to expect people in Canada to want to know what's going on because it will affect them. The other is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. It regulates civilian use of nuclear material. It licenses nuclear power plants in the US. It performs inspections. It enforces the NRC's and IAEA's rules. They also do audits, but they also manage waste safety. And the last is OSHA. OSHA doesn't just apply to nuclear, but because it is safety oriented, it does get a heavy say in how it gets used. Additionally, if an employee thinks what's going on is unsafe, it's a lot easier to contact OSHA than the NRC. They help with hazard identification. They do regular assessments, and they implement measures to mitigate these risks. They also ensure that all the workers know their rights, which sometimes can be confusing when you're working with a large company. Now, there are a handful of regulatory proposals. Unfortunately, a lot of those proposals are also ban nuclear use, but there are other ones that they want to introduce rigorous safety checks and balances. And they want to introduce more training for facility personnel, and they want to implement real-time monitoring systems. So that way, third parties who will keep you honest can tell what's going on inside the power plant. One big issue in the US is the waste management. The US has stringent standards on how nuclear waste gets stored and disposed of. Technically speaking, there is a long-term waste management solution, but right now, from an economic standpoint, what we're doing is what makes the most sense. Long-term, that will change, but as of right now, what we have is what's probably going to be what we use for a while. And then there's international cooperation and oversight. The US isn't the only country that uses nuclear power. There's a lot of other countries that use nuclear power. But by having a cooperation, we can see what best practices are, see what everybody else is doing, see how things are working for them, see how other economies are handling things. When there is an issue, there is some kind of meltdown, international cooperation is super important because it helps clean up fastest, because when there is a problem with the nuclear, time is not your ally. So some safety or regulation proposals include post-accident analysis of incidents like Chernobyl and Fukushima. These regulations ensure that the nuclear facilities are designed, maintained, and operated with the highest safety protocols to minimize the risk of accident. So this is more obvious with Chernobyl than the other two power plants, but you can design a reactor in such a way that when it malfunctions, it naturally shuts off, which is what Fukushima and 3 Mile Island did. The reason those accidents weren't worse was because they automatically shut down. Chernobyl was the opposite. As soon as things stopped working the way they were supposed to work, instead of cooling down, it heated up. The next is you have to improve public confidence. If 90% of the people don't like nuclear, you're not going to build a new nuclear power plant. It just is what it is. So stringent regulations help reduce the number of incidents, which increases confidence in nuclear power. When the public knows that there's rigorous testing and safety requirements, they're more reliant on it, they're more trusting of it. The more public confidence goes up, the more investments go into it, which then leads to better technology advancements. A lot of the tech advancements go straight to safety. And then there is the environmental impact. So yes, there is some waste from nuclear power, but for the most part, that is almost entirely recyclable. We just don't do it right now because it's not economically viable. However, once we start doing it, it will be economically viable. However, to satisfy electric demand in the US, as nice as wind and solar are, to get the orders of magnitude required for electric consumption, you're not going to find a better option than nuclear. So what's industry's role in building trust? Well, they have to agree that safety is paramount. They have to go out of their way that they are actively trying to be safe, which means that they have to do regular internal audits. They have to invite the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to come and do an audit. They have to invite OSHA to come do audits. They have to invite the general public to come see the facility to show that it's clean, that it is safe. They have to show that they are managing their waste correctly. They have to show that what they're doing is better for the environment than the alternative. They have to have regular public disclosures. A lot of places to meet a lot of, say, the OSHA requirements, every month you have to document what you did, and you have to show why what you did was safe. Usually those documents are kept internal. To be transparent, you have to make them public. So what are some subject matter experts in favor of nuclear power? This nice lady right here, I had to interview her for some security reasons last semester. This is Cameron Goodwin. She's the director of RINSC, Rhode Island Nuclear Science Center in Narragansett. She is in favor, particularly in favor of smaller modular designs. She's actually the one who pointed them out to me when I was making these slides. She works at the Bay campus. She is in favor of nuclear power. Opposed. Well, so I have Bernie Sanders here, but it's a lot of politicians. It's not just him. And the people opposed tend to be opposed regardless of party. Now, the reasons for being opposed tend to be different, but Bernie Sanders are, number one, safety concerns. Unfortunately, because of his age, every nuclear power plant is a Chernobyl, when in reality it's not. He's concerned about radioactive waste management. Again, he is a politician, not an engineer, so he doesn't fully understand how that works. But to be fair, it is very hard to store nuclear waste safely, and there's no guarantee. Well, there's no guarantees in life, but it's hard to check and validate that power plants are following their own rules. There is an inherent cost. Now, this cost is associated with the power plants you're familiar with, the large ones, the ones that have giant smokestacks. The small modular designs don't require as much of a footprint and therefore much cheaper. Bernie Sanders and a lot of politicians also prefer renewables. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not opposed to renewables, but considering what the end goal is and the deadlines we've set for ourselves, it's hard to meet them with renewables. So we're going to quickly go over some unexplored areas. So the first is fusion technology. I mentioned this earlier, fusion technology is really interesting, and there have been some major breakthroughs recently. However, we're not quite there yet. But all that really means is we just need more research. Doesn't mean anything wrong's happening. The next is waste recycling. There is nuclear waste, but nearly all of it is recyclable. The real reason we're not doing it is because there's a cost associated with it, and right now it's cheaper just to store than it is to recycle. But research into that area will bring that cost down, and it might end up being cheaper to recycle than to store. The next is advanced safety systems. Now, this happens regularly whether it's in nuclear power or not, because regular power plants have these early warning systems for different reasons. So just adding more safety systems to that would be good. There are a handful of studies that are currently being circulated that want to do long-term waste storage solutions. Basically figure out how long can you safely store nuclear waste before it becomes an issue. There's comparative studies of if we stick with fossil fuels the way we are versus switching to nuclear, what's the worst case scenario for both? Are we happy with the way we're going? Should we switch? So there is a cultural and generational consideration we need to make here. Older generations, a pattern, if you haven't picked it up yet, but you probably will soon, is the older somebody is, the harder it is to get them to change their mind. Their views are often shaped by experiences, and in this case, that would be the Cold War and the nuclear arms race. Additionally, there was initial skepticism about global warming and the finite nature of fossil fuels. I remember when I was in college, half of the adults I knew didn't believe in global warming. They didn't think it was real. They thought there was an unlimited supply of fossil fuels. As time went on, people started transitioning their beliefs. I think nowadays, most people are fully aware that climate change is real. There's a finite amount of gasoline. The younger generations, your generation, is generally more environmentally conscious. They're aware of what will happen if the environment is taken away from them. But they did see Fukushima happen, so they are worried about it. And they recognize the need for sustainable energy alternatives. Now, nuclear power is a solution. It might not be a popular solution, but it is a solution. There's a growing recognition that while renewable sources like wind and solar are valuable, they might not suffice to completely replace fossil fuels. Nuclear energy, with its higher energy output, is increasingly seen as a critical part of the energy mix needed to meet global demands sustainably. Awareness across generations and how this shapes attitudes towards nuclear energy as part of climate change solutions, or sorry. All right, the next is cultural sensitivity. So different countries, different cultures have different views on nuclear power. If you go to France, the vast majority of their energy comes from nuclear. If I remember correctly, somewhere around 2/3 of all of their electricity is made at a nuclear power plant. Clearly, they're in favor of it. However, countries like Japan and Germany are very opposed to it. Japan's opposed to it because Fukushima happened, and it happened in their country. Around the same time, mainly because of Fukushima, Germany decided to get rid of all of their nuclear power. Now, it's admirable. I can understand the need or want to do that. However, if you look at where they are now getting their power, it's still from nuclear. It's just, instead of the power plant being inside Germany somewhere, it's in Poland or France or Austria or Czechoslovakia, just not in Germany. And literally the power lines cross international borders. So a lot of it's still from nuclear. It's just now the nuclear is being made on the other side of the border. And there are instances where a power plant is built in France exclusively to supply power to Germany. You also have to understand local sentiment. The example of Germany illustrates the complexity of nuclear energy policy, where national declarations about nuclear power may contrast with the practical energy needs and cross-border energy dependency. In Japan, the decision to move away from nuclear energy is deeply influenced by Fukushima's incident, highlighting how local experiences can significantly shape national energy policy. The contrast between France's acceptance and Germany's rejection of nuclear power reflects the need to balance energy requirements with public sentiment and historical experiences. So, in conclusion, we do need to acknowledge that nuclear power has a dual nature. It could be hugely beneficial to us, but at the same time, if handled incorrectly, could be hugely disastrous. To get there, we need to be transparent. We have to have a good public perception. The only way to get that is to behave the way you're supposed to behave, and build and design and operate the way you're supposed to build, design, and operate. Over time, nuclear will regain its popularity, but it'll only do that if it does if it improves its public perception and transparency. Innovation in reactor design can get us there, can help, especially if we go to smaller, safer reactors. But lastly, there's this discussion of climate change and nuclear power. And I've said it a couple times now. In theory, there's enough silicon in the world to supply the world with solar power, which is great. I'm all for it. But the rate at which you'd have to manufacture these solar panels and install is enormous compared to the rate at which we'd have to build nuclear power plants. And getting the public behind anything that costs a lot of money tends to be very hard, because relatively speaking, nuclear is much cheaper than solar.